The way that I look at this panel next is the then what panel, right? We're getting all this data in, we're looking at all this information coming in, but how do you successfully bring together all of that data to make answers, to disseminate it out, to get a meaningful way forward? So we have several different panelists here giving their perspective. Just quick rounds of introductions and then we'll kick it off. First to my immediate left is Brian Collins, who is the CEO of Intera. First started his career honorably with the United States Marine Corps, so thank you for your service. And co-founded Intera in 2010, has been CEO since 2016. So welcome, Brian. Next is William Porter, who is the Senior Manager of the Operations Support within Team Rubicon, a 13-year Air Force veteran. All the way on my very left, excuse me. And he has been with Team Rubicon since 2012. Jessica Halsey is a Product Development Manager with BAE, specifically with the GXP team. He's been with BAE for over a decade. And finally, we have Eli Ibanga, who is a student at University of Southern California and coming from the East Coast USC of South Carolina versus Southern California. I'll give everyone that debate. Before that, honorably served in the Army with the Medical Service Corps officer. So I will kick it off to my immediate left to Brian for opening comments. Thanks. Brian, and you do have your 8-minute time limit. I have you here for it.
Right, two things I'm not good at, keeping time and not walking around on the stage. Is there, to advance the slides, do we have a clicker?
We will get one.
Okay, well, I'll move ahead and we'll see if the slides can catch up, which kind of goes to what we're talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and machine learning and what sort of the operational response community is looking for and what we've seen as successful up to this point. Thank you. And one of the themes you're going to hear us say is, and I know the military has used this a lot of time for many years, which is left of bang. In fire, we're starting to say left of ignition. Because the conditions we're seeing today are changing the way we respond to disasters and the types of information we need and how quickly we need it. Let's see, is that going to work? All right. So I'm going to give a history lesson very quickly to set the stage. 2007, 2008, 2009, roughly 12 to 10 years ago, was really the first time in disaster response, at least for wildland fire, that we had a bunch of events are starting to occur that exceeded our capacity to actually respond to them. This was Southern California, Northern California. It was also the first time we had a massive amount of remote sensing and geospatial data actually come out to us on the fire, right? So before that, I mean, really, this is the period of Katrina and the Southern California fires. There was sporadic use of remote sensing and GIS, but really, by the time we hit 2007, we were flooded with information. But we were not prepared for it. The incident commanders didn't have a way to get it. They also didn't have a way to trust the information they got, right? So using my Marine background, I mean, this is a famous quote, which is, you can give me information, but it's useless if I don't get it, if I don't understand it, or I don't believe it or trust in it. So if you think about 2007, this is an example of the data that was collected in 2007 in Southern California. I know it's hard to see the slide, but we had everything from U-2s, we had Global Hawks flying, and we were flooded trying to support 26 incidents out there today, or out there at the time. As we moved forward, we realized the big problem then was just getting the data was our biggest problem, right? Getting the flooded data out to us so we could actually get access to that data. I know Dan is here from the Civil Applications Committee. He was part of this way back in our younger days, which was a tremendous amount of data just getting it to the field. Today, we're doing the same thing, but we have to change the next step of that. We're getting data, we have interoperability, but now we have to get to knowledge. So this is an example. I'm going to talk about two specific fires today, but in 2019, what is different? And we had a big session in California with the California Fire Chiefs Association. With the Western Fire Chiefs has also been meeting. And what we're realizing today and putting out to the community is the scale of events we're seeing today in terms of speed, in terms of size, like how big an area that's affected, and how quickly things have to happen, require us to decentralize how we operate. At the same time, when we go to fires, we used to separate what was called initial attack from extended attack. So when you used to go to fire, initial attack is the first engine's on scene. It's about 0 to 6 hours, and your first thing to do was just sort of coordinate the first guys who were there, get a sense of it, and then vector in everybody else. But you had time, because that first 0 to 6 hours didn't move that fast. But from 6 to 12 is when you brought the command teams in, and you sort of handed over the hard problem to them, right? So that's really, you had this big transition. Today, and if you look at the Camp Fire or you look at the Thomas Fire, what we did in initial attack in the first 6 hours is what big command teams used to do in extended attack. The evacuation decisions that you make and the resource decisions in the first 6 hours are the same that we used to make in days into a fire in 2007. And the second is, or the final point is, everybody across the spectrum, from your incident commander to your first responder on the scene to the public, we're all in that same time frame. In the past, again, in a wildland fire, the public really didn't get affected for a while because usually the fire was kind of far from the urban interface. Now it's happening right in the urban interface, and they have to almost self-evacuate if they have the right information out there. The responders who are coming in need to know where to go or make a decision to not go where they were told to go because they're already overrun. So all the things we decide in the first 6 hours, we used to have hours and hours to do. Quick examples, I know for those who haven't followed all the after-action reports, but I'll summarize into 3 main things what we see as a difference. You can see it up on the screen. But basically, we call it unexpected fire behavior, but it's really rapid fire behavior. The fires are moving so fast now in the West that they're moving through landscape-level activities in hours and even minutes. When we do speaker or evacuations today, the public reacts very differently to evacuations. In fact, an anecdotal story is right now our homes, even in the urban interface, are so sealed up that after 8 o'clock, you cannot get an evacuation notice to an individual because they're inside double pane windows, they're watching Netflix, they're not watching the news, the radio's off. The only way you can get to them is social media on their phone. And also, as they move so fast, we're actually calling engines into a fire, sending them to a staging area, and by the time they even get halfway to the staging area, we have to move them to another staging area. We're moving so fast. What do people do on the ground when that happens? This is what initial attack commander has to do. He has to do life safety, figure out where he's going to set his resources, and he has to move them around. And if you think of the speed of information to do that in a large-scale fire, the amount of information that we have to send for an individual to make that decision would exceed our bandwidth to get there. And that's where I'd like to tee off for the group here, is what AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning is good at. We need to assess large amounts of data that come in, and we need to actually start looking at it before we hand it to an incident commander. So we need rapid analysis of that data to set up triggers and alerts, both for the incident commander, because on a fire, and even in this type of event, the balance between people and data is completely upset today. We have a tremendous amount of data, we don't have people to look at it, and we don't have the time to look at it. So the keys to us and to the fire community, and you'll see this in a lot of stuff that's coming out both in California, in Colorado, and all the Western fire chiefs, is we need to focus on pre- and post-event information, and this is what the focus I'd like to bring to the group is pre-planning. The ability to preset what your evacuation is and your suppression and resource needs before you start an event is extremely important today, because that's part of response. We need to know that before we get to a fire. We also need to mitigate, and we need to know what to mitigate. Right now, we do mitigation the same way we've done most of fire, hundreds of years of tradition unimpeded by progress. We need to target. There's not enough dollars to do fire breaks everywhere in the country. We need to target where we need to do mitigation measures. And we need to look at risk. We need to know where to put our risk assessments when we go forward. Again, this is a large AI project because we may not know the questions we're asking. Are we focusing on life safety, on social or economic issues, rather than infrastructure? When we get to an event, the big thing for us is to look at is how do we go faster? How do we alert the public at a simultaneous time that we're actually giving information to a first responder? That is a rapid, large-scale data process that requires us to do some machine learning on dynamic data and then build the models to do it in real time. Fire behavior, I'll show a little bit on fire behavior. You'll hear a lot about that later in the week when there's a wildfire panel, but how we predict where and when a fire goes has got to get faster and more accurate. The fire community often says, I see hurricane models on TV, why do my fire behavior models not work that way? And finally, I'll skip situational awareness because I think we're probably as a community pretty familiar with that. I'd like to focus on resource mobilization and assignment. Right now, we have tremendous amount of fire resources. Moving them around to the right place on a fire is very hard to do when you're sitting at the back of a pickup truck and you have a very limited bandwidth. So with the information we have available, and to actually start studying where and when and how rapidly to respond to that, we can help an incident commander recommend where someone gets assigned prior to them actually getting on the road and going en route to somebody. And I know my time is coming up, so I'd like to kind of summarize and tee up. Again, this is sort of a needs conversation, but I'm going to tell you, to get there is, what are we looking for? So pre-planning in the world, what's different than what we're doing and what I'm asking for, what the community is asking for you to address, is in the past, pre-planning to us was just do a GIS model, have an analyst look at it, put it on a map, and hand it out. In the future, we need our risk assessments to focus more on the social economic impact and the assessment of where people are and how quickly we can move them in a dynamic manner. How do I move a population at 8 o'clock at night is very different than how I move them at 12 noon. Alerting. Sending a bunch of data to someone on a map is no longer useful. We have too much data to send. We need to have intelligent algorithms that say, this is the thing to look at, because that guy at the back of an engine doesn't have time to look at a map and stare at a bunch of dots. He can respond to a text or a page or an intelligent alert. Fire behavior, I'll click through these, but fire behavior, which is a quick, rapid prediction of where the fire is going to go, this world is, and I won't go backwards, but that has got to go faster for us. Right now, this is an analyst in the loop, and if it's automated, it actually takes a tremendous amount of data, and it's actually, the types of models we run today don't actually reflect the fires that we're seeing today. So this is a tremendous area, both for the actual physics world to look at, as well as potentially to shift that to an AI problem. I'll skip mapping, because we're in a community and everybody maps. I'll talk about remote sensing. This is an example of what fire collected last year. The only reason I want to bring this up, so we talked about 4,700 collected scenes from commercial satellites that were collected. There are no remote sensing analysts in your fire community. They're part-time duty people who do extra work. It's a there is no army of people to do this. This is the one place that machine learning and AI could help us, because again, we don't have people to look at data, we just have people who need the data. And finally, I'll wrap by saying resource management. What we do today for resource management is we look and see where stuff is, we look where we're running out of, and we decide where it's going to go. But what I'd like us to start looking at is our data and say, recommend where someone goes. Because again, that incident commander needs quick options when he's on a fire. He can't sit and wait and then have to decide where he's going, particularly if he's focused on life safety. So that's my part. Sorry I took a little bit of your time. But I wanted to sort of set the stage of the problem. I think we in fire, we share the same problem that all the other disasters have, earthquakes, hurricanes, and flooding. Although we're probably last to the fight to realize we're in the same decision cycle you've been in years, and we're now starting to have to adapt to it.
Thank you, Brian. Eli, over to you.
So for me, this all began with a course I took at the beginning of my time at USC called Geospatial Intelligence Tradecraft. And what our professor did was he presented us with a realistic problem set. It was shortly after Hurricane Maria happened. And he said, pretend you have your own disaster management organization. How would you mitigate the issues there? How would you respond to that disaster and put everything back the way it needs to be? So based off previous experience, I started to think about the best way, of course, would be ideally if you could just mitigate the disaster completely, but a hurricane's not something you can get rid of. So in that case, how do you protect the people? How do you protect the resources? How do you, there's a lot of variables that come into play. And as I really started to consider the lots of different data sets that were available, at least to a degree, in order to get down to each individual person and their needs and concerns, the only thing that is really available to assist with that is artificial intelligence, machine learning, cloud computing, big data. So, how do you go back on this thing?
I could not figure out how to go backwards.
Oh, great. Okay, so in looking at the situation, really with the data acquisition and processing, and then your modeling, you really want to focus on the mitigation and preparation of the disaster management cycle, as opposed to response and recovery, where I feel like we oftentimes invest a lot of our time and our resources. Because we oftentimes, as a community, try and get in front of these issues, but there's only so much we can do with the amount of data we have. So it's really a paradigm shift in what we consider to be data and problems and what we're looking at, whereas oftentimes we look at a community or a city or a state and say, these are the types of issues, these are the demographics, really looking down to the individual level. So for example, if you have a person who has disability benefits, that's something we know as a government. We know how mobile they are, we know where they live, we know based off insurers what type of home they have, how resilient it is against what type of disaster may be in the area. And if we can collect and leverage that information, then we can develop personalized solutions essentially in order to decrease the cost of disaster management and to better help communities and individuals recover from these types of events. So in looking at the kind of what is proposed, there are certain benefits and a lot of barriers in place that prevent us from getting there at the time. It's very expected that there would be a huge financial reduction in terms of the recovery costs. Right now, as I stated earlier, we try and get in front of these things in terms of we know the storms are coming. We have emergency managers planning and working with communities in order to come up with a plan ahead of time, get people out of the way, initiate the movement of resources. But there's a lot of shortfalls that we don't always take into consideration. And by leveraging artificial intelligence with all this data that we can collect, it'll be able to find cost-effective solutions for us that we have yet to even identify potentially, just because we don't know where to look. We don't know what they are. By doing that, develop more personalized solutions, especially for poor areas, poor individuals, where we oftentimes see that they have a greater difficulty recovering from these types of events. We can increase the ability for their communities to recover and decrease loss of life in events like Hurricane Maria or Hurricane Katrina and lots of other disasters as well. Looking at the barriers, a big part is data availability. That's not to say the data's not there. It very obviously is, but at the time we have no collective resources to utilize the data. It's not being shared. That may be because the industry at this time has not necessarily determined the financial benefit of sharing and processing that data on a large level. Also, there tends to be a barrier in terms of regulation and law and accessing the data in some cases. And looking at medical information, there's HIPAA regulation that can prevent us from sharing or using that in lots of different aspects to a degree. And with the previous concerns with the US public in terms of something, for example, like the USA Patriot Act, there may be concerns as we move towards this type of environment where people are over concerned with the large amount of data being shared with the government. Although we live in an age where arguably people share more about themselves than ever before, there's also a lot of concern with sharing that information with the government at the very same time. So at this time, what I wanted to do, I've kind of spent my time talking about this in a broad sense and some of the ideas where it can be used. Based off my specific background, I wanted to dive a little deeper into a specific example focusing on medical records. I talked about if someone has disability benefits, or let's say someone breaks their leg, they go to the hospital. The hospital obviously knows where they live. They know what the injury is. We know that person's not mobile. There's, in theory, no reason why that person can't be coded into a system. And on the back end, an emergency manager knows Eli Ibanga broke both of his legs. He's immobile. He doesn't have any family in the area. There's a disaster coming. He's not that wealthy, so there's all these variables that can be taken into consideration for a personalized solution, cost-effective solution for helping someone like that out. So in looking on the front end, we have hospitals with their medical records keeping systems. Now, these systems are sometimes very archaic. Lots of hospitals still use paper records. I'm sure all of you have at some point gone to the doctor and then later on in your life tried to go to a different doctor and wondered why they don't have your information or it has to get faxed over or sent over. And there's a big push in digitizing these records, but oftentimes the the systems don't talk. There's barriers from cost and just the way healthcare works in America. So there are other organizations known as health information exchanges, which digitize the records and share them. But again, there's a financial barrier. There's a needs to know in terms of HIPAA and patients allowing the release of their data. And then there's multiple HIEs that don't necessarily share that data together. And it's all in various formats. So by leveraging machine learning and artificial intelligence, we can take that information from the HIEs and process it, code it, and come up with solutions when overlaid with disasters and whatever type of categorization we want to do of communities in order to identify potential barriers to recovery and potential people that are at risk, because we'll know what's physically wrong with them, what medications they may need when we evacuate them. And we have all that information on the front end. And then we can take that information and share it with government, share it potentially with different NGOs or agencies that are working to manage these types of disasters and provide more effective and cost-effective solutions for everyone.
Thank you, Eli. And before we turn it over to Jessica, just another friendly reminder for questions. Please make sure to submit them either through texting them to 31313 or writing them on the piece of paper here. We'll make sure to get an ample Q&A time for the panelists here. So Jessica, with that, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience approaching AI, machine learning, computer vision techniques, and how we're looking to roll those out to impact disaster response. So, when we talk about AI here, we look at this picture of the brain. On the blue, we're representing maybe what our machines can bring to the equation. And then the pink there is going to actually be my visual cue to remind us of what we bring as humans with our intelligence. And we start really what we're trying to understand from disaster response and geospatial intelligence and how we can apply these capabilities to improve is we need to look at how we approach the problem. What are we trying to understand? What are the questions that we need to ask? What are the answers that we're looking to get so that we can impact the response in a meaningful way to ultimately lead to quicker recovery, better resource utilization, et cetera. And so we break it down from how we process what we see, how we get information from the myriad of sources, and then link that together to better inform. And it really comes down to what I'm going to talk about is some really simple things that we do and how we learn even at a very young age through observation and classification. So we observe the world around us, and then we classify that experience as good, bad, or leading to some decision of some kind. And then throughout that, we, over time, are able to develop patterns and start to recognize these patterns that then contribute to reinforce that feedback loop. And so while there's a ton of complexity that we're talking about in this tradecraft, it really comes down to understanding those simple questions that we need to ask, and then trying to find the data, the sources, et cetera, the techniques that will link us to that. And then along those, some of the risks that we're looking at here are, the trust in the data. How many nines do we need to put forth into the community before it's believable and it's used by an operator, by a member of a recon team? And so all of those things need to be weighed in. And so we'll talk about some of the simplistic practical applications that we're seeing and how we're approaching this with the work that BAE is doing as well and our partners. So this is an image that was taken, I think, during Hurricane Florence. And so we'll look over here and see, what would a machine be able to glean from this? So we can possibly understand that there might be internal damage from the house because things are being moved outside of it. There's a downed tree that is detectable. There's standing water that's detectable. But then, what are we going to be actually trying to understand about this scene? So the human in this can say, well, the tree's not blocking the egress to this property. The standing water is not actually encroaching up to the physical residence, so that's important to know. And it looks like people are moving things out of the house, which tells me that there's actively people at that property, at least, around the time that this image was taken. So, this is important because we're seeing some computer vision techniques here, right? But then we want to link that to where we can actually get to the decision making. And so a couple of examples here of how we might use some of these technologies here. So for Hurricane Florence, when that storm came in, we knew that in this case, Team Rubicon was going to be in the area for a while assisting people. So they needed to understand where they might be able to stage a forward operating base. So we have to bring in, X amount of equipment, people. We have to be near, this affected area. We want to be near fuel and freeway access so that we can transport all of this stuff where it needs to go. And it has to not be underwater. And so what this is showing here is actually the results of some of these techniques where we've taken computer vision and we were able to extract from imagery parking lots that would be of a suitable size. And those are shown there in the green areas. But then we also said, well, we said they can't be underwater. So we ran synthetic aperture radar-based flood detection, and we found where there was significant standing water, and we did an intersect. And so you can see the red polygon there came back with standing water results. And so the idea is that you wouldn't pick that one, and we could now start to get closer to that active decision-making like a human would do by merging multiple sources and multiple AI techniques to guide that information, that decision that needs to be made. And then, oh, by the way, so this is forgot to do my animation. So this is the process that we did to find what we would come up with. So this is the human being able to say, okay, I found possible areas of flood, and then making the decision from there. And then, by the way, that's the location that they picked. So we still didn't get it right. And so I encourage all of the thought leaders that are here today, to understand that this is a little bit of a long game, and especially when we're talking about pivoting a lot of the tradecraft that we've been doing for 30 plus years for the traditional GEOINT community, and leveraging all of these sources that are available from now commercial and open and even other data sources fusing into that intelligence and Earth observation picture, that we really are playing a long game here. And it's important that getting involved with the end use case and understanding what questions we're trying to ask is essential to the feedback so that we can get better, so the next time we will get it right. So when we talk about Hurricane Harvey, this is what kicked off our work in the disaster response space and how we started looking at these use cases. Flood maps derived from Earth observation data were very important to inform the reconnaissance and planning efforts. So we'll give a little example of that here. And I like this because what we were actually able to do here, this is a fun picture of a partner of ours that helped us for this Hurricane Harvey response doing some flood analytics. And they came back with a result that they weren't sure was right. So we heard about verification and validation earlier as an essential part of this feedback loop. The flood depth was so high that they were questioning the results of the algorithm. And as they were interacting in the portal, they actually happened to find a ground photo that had been taken from a member of the reconnaissance team through the mobile app. And that ground photo actually showed how high the floodwater was with an overpass that had the height of the bridge listed there. So it was a really interesting use case where we actually had that ground photo being able to act as an internal validation to the AI so that they could publish that result with an understanding that it would be good data. And there's the picture of that photo a little bit closer along with the flood there showing in white. So that was a pretty interesting example that emerged. And the takeaway here is really that importance of using multiple sources. So if social media happens to be the most current timely way that people are reporting information about a place on the earth through keywords, both structured and unstructured data. We have to get that information and then use that to actually guide the way that we're structuring our approaches to machine learning on the Earth observation side. And so this was an example where we had, satellites plus mobile phones kind of feeding together, but there's no reason why this couldn't be your Internet of Things, social media, even spreadsheets and true structured data can start to loop in and inform these responses. And then you can even put it all together and I don't know, maybe quantum comes in here somewhere. And that's really where we're gonna start to get to where we can provide anticipatory intelligence to affect and aid in decision-making for disaster response. Because another point of all this is that we've heard it a couple times, there's so much data, there's not enough people, there's gaps in terms of transitioning the tradecraft and the knowledge. So we have to get simple, we have to be able to come up with ways to deal with the entire landscape, not just what's being collected above. And I will hand that over to William, excuse me.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm William Porter. A little bit about Team Rubicon. We are a national nonprofit made up of military veterans and first responders. Born after the Haiti earthquake in 2010, call to action, seeing the events unfold in Haiti. We had military members who had recently separated and said, I can operate in that environment, I can do it safely, and I can help save lives. Unfortunately, traditional NGOs at the time felt that it was too dangerous to operate in that environment, that only the military was there. So there was a delay in that delivery of service to those survivors, which ultimately led to people dying in the street. That was not something that sat well with us, so we actually started to self-fund, self-mobilize, and deploy to Haiti. Since that time, Team Rubicon became a international medical response organization. And because of all the disasters that have occurred in the United States, we started deploying, I'm cutting out now. We started deploying domestically as well. So we have 102,000 members across the United States. We also have affiliates now in UK, Canada, Norway, Australia. We are the fastest growing nonprofit in North America, and we're the first nonprofit to get the World Health Organization Emergency Medical Team certification. So a little bit about what we've done so far. We are a data-driven organization. We recognize that in order to get people on the ground anywhere in the world within 24 hours after a disaster, we need this data. Currently, it's being held by commercial entities or it's being held by the federal government, and nonprofits make up the bulk of the relief efforts after a disaster, and they aren't getting access to that data. So we set out a couple of years ago to start solving this problem. Maxar was one of the first adopters with Team Rubicon. They started providing their data early on to us, but we couldn't make it actionable. We do have some classically trained GEOINTers, but not enough to really scale our organization and really apply it effectively. So that's where Geospatial Exploitation Products, a subsidiary of BAE Systems, stepped up, and they have really helped us operationalize this capability. So some of the things that Jessica talked about is our trajectory from GXP coming in with that data from Maxar and helping us really create our own sustainable model to where we can get those boots on the ground and start affecting that disaster cycle anywhere in the world within 24 hours. So let's talk a little bit about that. So September 13th, 2018, I guess I just need to lean back a little bit. September 13th, 2018, Hurricane Florence is coming in, we knew it. We started pre-positioning resources in Charlotte, North Carolina in preparation for a very large storm. As Jessica said, we, being military veterans, will put ourselves in the path of danger in order to inform the local public, inform other NGOs, and start affecting that disaster cycle as fast as possible. So that's exactly what we did. We sent 22 people to Charlotte, North Carolina to ride out the storm, knowing that it was going to be a very big event. But also recognizing that Wilmington, North Carolina, being below the floodplain, and that being the epicenter where the eye wall was going to approach, we knew we had to get somebody there. With the rapid downgrade of Hurricane Florence going from a Category 4 storm to a Category 1, we felt kind of comfortable putting our members in the eye wall during the storm. So that's what we did. We sent a team to Wilmington, North Carolina, and they actually were there present when the eye wall passed over Wilmington. They were taking that information, as Jess said, of are there trees down? Are there people that are out and they're still staying in their homes that needed help? They were collecting that information as the hurricane was going over. And that's important, right? To Eli's point, that's informing the emergency managers. That's informing the rest of the NGO community. That's informing FEMA. No one else was able to provide that data at that time. And I'm a prior cop. Usually when a hurricane comes in at a certain threshold, they will pull all of their people out and get them in a safe area. So at that stage, the only people that were in that location were us and the survivors that stayed. But this is the interesting thing. It became a flood event, kind of like what happened during Hurricane Harvey. This bridge, it's a highway that goes over basically a sound area. It started flooding, and that's really the only way that keeps Wilmington, North Carolina connected to the rest of the mainland. With this water, huge amounts of precipitation, dropping down, the bridge started flooding, and they said basically once the water crested the bridge, it wouldn't be open for the next 2 weeks. So we're pretty brazen, but we decided that probably wasn't good enough for us, so we sent the team back to Charlotte. But then we had this interesting thing. It started flooding in all these other locations in North Carolina. And so we have a lot of resources, and a lot of other NGOs have a lot of resources, but what do you do and where do you start? Especially when the entire state is flooding, essentially. This is what's being put out on mainstream media at the time. Literally everywhere you turned, there's flooding everywhere. This is a North Carolina Department of Transportation map showing all the roads that are closed due to Hurricane Florence flooding. Where do you go? Where do you start? So we decided to start in New Bern, North Carolina. We knew that there were water rescues taking place. We do have trained swiftwater rescue personnel. We also have personnel that are capable of operating safely in that environment to report that information. So we started sending them to New Bern. A trip that normally takes 4 hours, it took us 8.5 hours because of all the road closures. But along the way, we decided that we needed to inform the greater public, we needed to inform the emergency managers, and we needed to inform FEMA, who at that time was in an information gap. They did not know what was going on after this hurricane. So we started collecting this information to the point of, there being too much information. At this point, there wasn't enough. There wasn't enough information to really inform the response that was going on. All those life safety operations that were occurring, they were essentially operating in a vacuum. So we started collecting that information. Things like, are the gas stations open? Are the roads even open? So we started reporting that out, collecting it and reporting it out. And while that was going on, we sent another team out to Goldsboro, North Carolina. Same thing. We started collecting this information that really impacted the traditional response and informed the decisions of the incident command on the ground at the time. People are running generators, there's power off, where is there points of distribution, those types of essential mapping that needs to take place so the greater public could be informed. And then we also documented which roads were actually closed and which ones weren't, because at that time, you'll see in a second, the Department of Transportation continued to say that there are no open roads in North Carolina. So we were clearly operating in that environment. So the ground truth showed that there actually were roads that were open, and we were informing everyone of what was going on. So we finally sent the team back into Wilmington a couple of days later. It actually took us 13 hours to get there. You can see the route that we took because that was the road that was open, and that was obviously how we had to get there. And some of you guys have seen this, seen something like this before, a GRG. When we came to, talking to Maxar and then with GXP, initially during Hurricane Harvey, GXP did all the analytics for us, but starting really with Hurricane Florence, we were able to do all of this organically. We've had a series of training classes, a series of brainstorming sessions, things like that, to make this our own organic capability, because when push comes to shove and we need to get people out the door, we need to have that capability at our National Operations Center in Dallas, Texas. So you'll see it's kind of rudimentary at this point, but these are literally non-classically trained GEOINTers that are putting this together so we can scale to the level 4 disaster response. And what we're looking at this point is the typical things you would see during disaster response. Is there a home damaged? Is the road open? Things like that. And while we're going through this, Hurricane Michael happens. So kind of the same thing. We started sending people down to the panhandle of Florida to get into the advanced locations so we could affect this disaster cycle. And we knew that this was a much larger storm. We knew that it was going to be a major wind event, unlike Hurricane Florence. And we knew that one of the biggest impacts to the society, to the first responders, to everyone at that time, were the roads being open. So we started mobilizing resources to get to Panama City and Mexico Beach as fast as possible with chainsaws and with heavy equipment to start opening those roads, those major lifelines, so the survivors could start, on that road to recovery. And this is what our team saw. This is 6 hours after Hurricane Michael passes over Mexico Beach. That's actually a road. I didn't realize when we got that picture from the field. That's how much debris is blocking that roadway and preventing a survivor from going to the hospital, preventing somebody from checking on their mother who is, possibly in hospice care. You have to think about those things. To Eli's point, the emergency managers are at a huge disadvantage in order to get that information they need, so we were bridging that gap. And then we started to incorporate things like social media. And I will bear in mind, we have some analytics that we're implementing right now, but the majority of this is done by hand jamming. Imagine how much quicker it would be if even a portion of you guys in this room, helped out a nonprofit with your machine learning or AI solutions. The knowledge that you have here, imagine how many lives you could save. So until that time, we're going to keep deploying volunteers, and we're going to do this the good old-fashioned way, putting people on the ground and reporting the information. Products like this informed our nonprofit community, which ultimately there's 135 major nonprofits that do disaster response. A lot of them were not responding because there was a lack of information. So we're positioning ourselves as that information node to start feeding that information to them so they can get, as you guys understand, the right tools, the right equipment, and the right personnel on the ground at the right time. Because until that happens, they will sit back and they actually will not respond until they get that information. So obviously a series of products, and if you remember the GRG earlier, very rough around the edges. We were able to iterate on this, through the weeks of our response to make a very professional product that we are now pushing out to the likes of FEMA and local emergency managers. But again, we want to be quick. We want to inform the decision makers. We want to have all that data that's currently either sitting in a commercial setting or sitting on federal servers. Because again, nonprofits are doing over 75% of the disaster relief. And Team Rubicon can harness that data with volunteers and support from corporate entities like in this room.
All right, thank you very much, William. Appreciate it. I think it's very clear that, Barry, as we were talking about titles here, I suggested the then what. I'm going to propose that we are the team Earth, Wind, and Fire for the rest of the day, so we will respond to that as well. For the question portion, we got about 2 minutes left here, so I might just get one. But interesting one, 3 or 4 are revolving around trust. So Brian, first to you, where's that tipping point from trust for the veterans that you have in the field for this new artificial intelligence, machine learning, especially with models as it comes to fire for you?
Right, and that's a good point because one, I think all three of us brought it up, and we're experiencing on a daily basis, or at least a yearly basis in fire, because new things come out to fire when we go to response pretty much every year. I'll give two sides to it. One is the fire modeling world. So we have, the fire community has been doing modeling for about 20 years. The idea of introducing a new model to the fire community is actually hard to gain their trust, because there are people, there's an embedded training cycle and culture to the existing model that exists. That is going to be, interestingly enough, probably one of the most important things we need in fire, yet it's a generational cultural problem, because fire is very much, I don't like my model, but at least I know how bad it is. If you give me a new one, I don't know how bad it is, right? That's kind of the theory. The only way we're going to get past that is doing it. I would say there's another side, which is automated alerting, which is really what we need to go to. The one good thing about fire is very used to having alerts. If you've ever hung out with firefighters and police officers, all they do is check their pager 24 hours a day. And the source of that pager is a 911 center. So this is what I've always, the science community actually is placing more restrictions on their alerting capability than firefighters and police are. Firefighters and police know that a 911 call is by someone who's in harm's way, doesn't know what's going on, and just wants to call and report something. So they automatically know when they get a page, someone says, I smell smoke. That's actually what many calls are to fire. So having an alerting algorithm that goes out and says, I think there's a fire, I think there's a flood here, is actually not any less accurate than what they get today. You're just pushing it to them. The key is going to be a feedback mechanism. And we've even talked about the fact that for firefighters, they're used to a pager, but two-way paging is now coming up. Broadband from FirstNet is going to come up. And alerts give us now a process to say, hey, thumbs up, thumbs down, right? You can get automatic feedback on alerting. So trust is hard. We have been stressing with the fire community to start doing it. And that is one good thing is although we need a bridge between the science and the operational community, the fire community, and I think most operators now, are now open to trying, because the types of decisions they're making today require this, because they just can't look at the data. So we've talked to, and this past year, lots of sessions have been on automated alerting and fire behavior models, and the response has come back that says, just start giving it to me. Don't hold back. Let me decide and give me a feedback loop to it. So I think trust is hard, but the community is ready, because they can't deal with it without it.
And I think that's what we're going to learn about all week, right? That relationship, how do we move forward? So I know that we're out of time. I know that each of the panelists will be here all week. Certainly look forward to further questions, answers, and getting to know everyone here. So Brian, Eli, Jessica, William, thank you very much for the time. Look forward to the next session.